The sun, in its habitual modesty, filtered lazily through Flaxborough's overcast sky, lending the town an air of polite ordinariness. On the village green, the annual summer flower show was in full swing, and Mrs. Pigeon, whose roses had won 3 consecutive silver cups, was fussing over their petals as though they were small, demanding children. The gentle murmur of neighbours exchanging compliments and backhanded criticisms provided the soundtrack of civic propriety. Inspector Purbright, standing slightly apart near the marquee, observed without comment. To the casual onlooker, he might have appeared no more than a visitor with a mild interest in horticulture, but he had learned early that in Flaxborough even the most innocuous event carried 1,000 whispered subplots. He noticed the subtle twitch of Mr. Carraway's moustache when Mrs. Pigeon praised his dahlias, the slightly too loud laughter of Miss Fenton at a joke only she seemed to understand, and the peculiar way Reverend Aldridge lingered near the prize exhibits as if the blooms themselves demanded confession. The quiet hum of polite chatter was abruptly shattered by a minor but unmistakable commotion. A scream, high-pitched and short, came from the direction of the refreshment tent. Patrons paused mid-sip, mid-compliment, mid-gesture, and turned collectively, their faces registering alarm, curiosity, and a touch of indignation at being disturbed on such a fine morning. At the centre of the disturbance was Mr. Redmayne, chairman of the Flower Show Committee, who was now crouched beside the collapsed figure of the town vicar, Reverend Aldridge. The good man's eyes were open but unseeing, his hands rigidly clutching a small, leather-bound notebook. His clerical collar, usually pristine, was slightly askew. "Oh dear," Mrs. Pigeon exclaimed, wringing her hands so vigorously that several petals detached from her prize-winning rose. "Is he— oh, can it be? Is he ill?" A few onlookers murmured, others whispered theories. A sudden faint, perhaps a dizzy spell, brought on by the summer heat, or, less openly, yet unmistakably, the possibility of something more untoward. Purbright approached slowly, his gait measured, his expression polite but attentive. Kneeling beside the vicar, he observed the notebook clutched in his hands. It was a small, ordinary thing, yet to Purbright it seemed charged with significance, as if it might quietly hold the key to understanding why a man of such habitual routine could collapse so dramatically in public. "I believe he is conscious," said Dr. Larkins, who had been summoned from the edge of the green. His tone, though calm, betrayed a subtle disbelief. "But he is unresponsive." "Unresponsive, or unwilling to speak?" Purbright asked softly, his voice more an observation than a question. No one quite noticed that it was addressed to no one in particular, and yet it seemed to settle the crowd into a slightly more anxious silence. The vicar made a small, almost imperceptible sound, half gasp, half sigh. His eyes flickered to Purbright's, and for a moment there was a flash of something unspoken, perhaps fear, perhaps recognition, perhaps regret. Then the flutter of his eyelids slowed, and he sank back as if the effort of life itself were now an inconvenience. Around them, the flower show resumed its delicate imbalance between gaiety and gossip. Mrs. Pigeon muttered about the impropriety of a faint in public. Mr. Redmayne fussed over the vicar's collar, and a small knot of townsfolk speculated in hushed tones about the cause, but Purbright, as always, observed quietly. There was no immediate crime here, yet the unusual manner of the vicar's collapse, the notebook, the barely there expression, all hinted at a subtle disturbance beneath Flaxborough's sunlit civility. And in that moment, as the town held its breath politely, the first whisper of mystery drifted on the summer breeze, unnoticed by everyone except Inspector Purbright. By mid-afternoon, Flaxborough's flower show had settled into a curious equilibrium between normality and quiet disturbance. The vicar had been escorted to the rectory by Dr. Larkins, who promised only that he would keep a careful watch, though the exact meaning of that phrase remained as nebulous as the town's collective understanding of why Reverend Aldridge had collapsed in the first place. Meanwhile, the townsfolk returned, in a hesitant sort of manner, to the routines of display judging and polite conversation, though the previous incident had left a subtle tension in the air, like a thread pulled taut beneath the calm surface of a domestic carpet. Mrs. Pigeon, still clutching the remnants of her rose, moved among the exhibits as though performing a slow ritual of reassurance. She murmured small reassurances to the plants themselves, as if coaxing them to forgive the impropriety of human distraction. Mr. Redmayne, in contrast, hovered near the marquee, issuing low-toned directions to anyone who appeared capable of following them, all the while shooting brief, nervous glances toward the rectory road. Even the children, who had been allowed to bring small bouquets and compete in the novice category, seemed to sense the town's muted anxiety and scuttled about with a polite wariness. By the time Purbright wandered toward the refreshments tent, he was already aware of the whispered interpretations multiplying among the townsfolk. Gossip, as always in Flaxborough, moved faster than the facts, and each new retelling added an unintentional flourish, often betraying more about the teller than the tale. He heard Mrs. Fenton murmuring to her neighbour about a supposed secret scandal in the rectory, a story which grew more elaborate with every passing minute. Mr. Carroway, seated near the lemonade stand, offered his own version of events to anyone who would listen, suggesting the collapse was perhaps the result of some long-buried clerical anxiety, a hypothesis that seemed plausible only because it painted the vicar in the gently excitable light that Flaxborough found most digestible. Purbright, moving deliberately between small groups of spectators, allowed the stories to unfold in their natural exaggerations, absorbing the contradictions and half-truths that seemed to excite each person differently. A man who had been positioned near the prize-winning roses swore that the vicar had seemed pale and distracted all morning. A lady who had spent the morning judging the dahlias insisted that he had looked perfectly fine just before his fall. These conflicting recollections, trivial as they seemed, were precisely the sort of material that could reveal hidden motives or unintended insights once observed with patience. By mid-afternoon, the gossip had begun to coalesce around a central theory, at least in the minds of most of the committee, that something in the vicar's notebook must have triggered the collapse. The book, now safely in the possession of Mrs. Pigeon, had been carried to the refreshment table, where she laid it gingerly between a cup of weak tea and a plate of scones. She regarded it with the same intensity she might have devoted to a particularly delicate bloom, occasionally tilting it and peering at the leather binding, as if expecting it to offer its secrets in response to a sufficiently devoted stare. Purbright, observing from the periphery, made a small note of how many people were drawn to the book. It was not mere curiosity that animated them. It was the delicate interplay of status, familiarity, and personal imagination. Flaxborough, as he well knew, was a town that thrived on perceived insight, particularly when it allowed citizens to claim understanding of others' private lives. Each person who lingered by the notebook seemed to be negotiating an unspoken question. If the vicar's collapse revealed some hidden truth, who among us would be implicated, however indirectly, in the moral fabric of it? By the late afternoon, the committee had begun to tidy the flower show with a gentle urgency, though there was a noticeable reluctance to disturb the arrangements too much. Mrs. Pigeon rearranged her roses with a tremulous diligence. Mr. Redmayne checked the scoring sheets and muttered about logistics, and Miss Fenton, who had remained conspicuously distant from the main crowd, took the opportunity to wander among the exhibits, her steps measured and her expression unreadable. Purbright observed her as she paused at the rose display, fingering the petals without touching them, as if testing the air itself for subtle irregularities. He filed the gesture away, small and inconspicuous, knowing that these little quirks often spoke louder than overt declarations. As the day waned, the townspeople began to drift homewards, many commenting on the peculiar incident with the vicar, often in tones designed to reassure themselves that it was an isolated anomaly. Yet a subtle sense of anticipation lingered, manifesting most clearly in the manner in which conversations tapered off whenever someone mentioned the rectory. The vicar himself, it seemed, had become an invisible pivot around which the entire town subtly shifted its attention and energies, though nobody could say precisely why. It was in this quiet interlude that Purbright took the opportunity to engage with the less obvious participants in the scene. He stopped by the refreshment tent, not for tea, but to ask a few carefully considered questions about the vicar's morning routine. He spoke first to Mrs. Pigeon in a tone that was deliberately gentle. "Did you notice anything unusual about his morning?" he asked, sipping nothing at all, merely maintaining the appearance of social engagement. Mrs. Pigeon, adjusting her apron and frowning at the tea-stained tablecloth, looked thoughtful. "Oh, Inspector, nothing overt, really. He arrived, as he always does, a little early to inspect the flower beds, polite as ever. But now that you mention it, he did linger a little longer than usual near the dahlias, almost as if he were expecting something. Or someone." "Someone?" Purbright asked softly. He allowed the word to hang, giving her time to elaborate. "Well," she said, lowering her voice just slightly, "perhaps I am imagining things, but it seemed to me that he looked around more than usual, as if waiting for a particular person to appear. I did not see anyone, mind you, but the gesture, well, it was odd." Purbright made a small note, internal rather than written. The vicar, it seemed, had been anticipating someone's arrival, or dreading it. He moved on to Mr. Redmayne, whose demeanour had returned to a near-official briskness. "I presume you found nothing unusual among the exhibits?" Purbright asked, nodding slightly. Mr. Redmayne shook his head, though his fingers fidgeted with the edge of a scoring sheet. "Nothing, Inspector. Absolutely routine until that unfortunate fainting spell. The flowers themselves were pristine, the displays intact. Nothing to account for such an episode, unless—" He hesitated, glancing around as though the suggestion might be overheard, or unless it was a matter of nerves or some trivial domestic concern troubling the vicar. "He's a sensitive sort, you see." "Indeed," said Purbright, inclining his head. "One finds that trivial concerns often assume remarkable importance when viewed from a certain angle." He thanked Mr. Redmayne and moved toward the periphery of the green, where he observed the quietly ongoing social dances of Flaxborough life. Children ran between flower beds, the gardeners muttered over wilted petals, and a few older residents discussed the merits of the horticultural societies, new rules with the kind of solemnity one reserves for parliamentary debate. Yet amid all this, the vicar's absence created a peculiar spatial void, a gap around which attention orbited subtly, never fully acknowledging that the focal point, the man himself, was no longer present. By evening, the last of the exhibitors had begun to pack away their prizes, and the marquee was being dismantled with polite efficiency. Purbright lingered for a moment, noting the residual conversations, the sidelong glances, the micro-expressions of anticipation and curiosity. Something small, something apparently trivial, had already begun to surface in the whispered fragments of observation, a repeated glance here, a hesitated remark there, a certain insistence on mentioning the vicar's notebook without actually opening it. He paused beside the refreshment table, now largely abandoned, and allowed his gaze to settle on the leather-bound notebook. The book itself seemed innocent enough, yet its very presence hinted at a disturbance that, to most of Flaxborough, would remain abstract and undefined. Purbright could not yet say why the vicar had collapsed, nor what secrets might be tucked within the neatly bound pages, but he knew that, as in all matters of small-town disturbance, the truth would reveal itself not in the dramatic, but in the polite, the trivial, and the overlooked. As dusk settled over the green, casting long, polite shadows over the exhibits, Purbright allowed himself a small, inward acknowledgment. The flower show was over, but the story had only just begun, and in Flaxborough, stories, once begun, had a peculiar persistence, growing quietly in corners, muttering between neighbours, and waiting, always waiting, for the observant eye to notice their significance. The morning following the flower show brought Flaxborough to its customary gentle rhythm, but with a subtle undercurrent of unease that seemed to ripple through even the most mundane interactions. Shops opened their doors on schedule, the baker's oven hissed with the steady punctuality of fresh loaves, and the postman threaded his way along narrow lanes as though every doorstep held secrets he was not quite meant to discover. Yet, for those attuned to the town's quieter signals, the absence of the vicar from his usual rounds was like a missing stitch in a familiar tapestry, drawing attention in ways both deliberate and subconscious. Inspector Purbright arrived at the rectory shortly after breakfast, nodding politely to the gardener, who had already begun the morning's tasks. The man, though unremarkable in appearance, had a face shaped by habitual observation, lines etched not by hardship alone, but by the perpetual calculation of social nuance. Purbright noted him, but said nothing, allowing the man to continue raking leaves with a diligence bordering on ritualistic. He entered the rectory with measured steps, greeted in the hall by Dr. Larkins, who seemed relieved to see him, but retained a certain hesitancy in speech, as if one wrong word could upset the delicate balance of a morning already disrupted by the vicar's fainting episode. "Inspector," Larkins began, removing his hat with slightly trembling hands. He slept restlessly through the night. There were a few murmurs, nothing comprehensible, but he seems stable now, though he has yet to speak coherently. "I confess I find it peculiar. Not the fainting itself, perhaps, but the suddenness of it. One might expect some gradual warning in someone of his age and disposition, yet—" He trailed off, glancing at the vicar's study door, as though expecting it to offer an immediate answer. Purbright inclined his head, a gesture that encouraged explanation without imposing judgment. "Indeed, Dr. Larkins, sometimes the abrupt is far more telling than the gradual, though not always in the manner one initially presumes." "And the notebook? Has it remained here?" "Yes," Larkins replied, leading the way to a small study. "I ensured it remained untouched. He clutched it when he fell, you see, and I thought it prudent not to disturb the contents until your inspection." The notebook lay on a side table, its leather cover catching the morning light, unassuming yet clearly significant to those who knew the vicar's habits. Purbright's gaze lingered for a moment before he allowed his attention to drift toward other small details. A teacup, still half full, a chair slightly askew, a stack of correspondence that suggested an orderly mind now rendered temporarily inaccessible. He spoke quietly, more to himself than to Larkins. "Even the smallest inconsistencies may speak volumes. A misplaced chair, a half-empty cup, the order of letters. These are traces of human rhythm interrupted." Dr. Larkins nodded slowly, though the uncertainty in his eyes betrayed him. "Yes, Inspector, though one wonders if the disruption lies within the physical world, or perhaps within the mind. He is a man accustomed to control, and to see him So vulnerable is frankly unsettling to all who know him. Purbright made a note of the phrasing. The emphasis on control, on the expectation of authority. It was an angle he would return to later once the town's gossip had further matured and the behavior of key figures could be observed in context. For now, he needed to canvass those who had witnessed the incident directly. He stepped into the quiet morning streets where Flaxborough's early risers were beginning to mingle with the first wave of shopkeepers and deliverymen. His first call was to Mrs. Pigeon, who had already arranged her roses by the front window and seemed to be bracing herself for inquiries. Her expression brightened faintly at his arrival, though her hands betrayed a minor tremor as she fussed with a ribbon that had slipped during the previous day's excitement. "Inspector," she said, her voice tinged with the kind of anxious pride that accompanies the desire to be helpful. "I am so relieved you are here." The vicar. Well, it was all so sudden, and there were those who suggested, rather unkindly, that he might have fainted from fright, or perhaps shock at something untoward in the garden. I do not believe it, of course, but the gossip is relentless. Purbright inclined his head slightly. It would be difficult, perhaps, for the ordinary observer to distinguish between fright and other causes. Were there any peculiar occurrences immediately preceding his collapse? Mrs. Pigeon paused, considering. Now that you mention it, yes, there was something odd. He spent a long time near the dahlias, as I said before, but also he seemed distracted, not in the way one might expect from simple observation. It was more internal. He kept glancing toward the lane that leads to the rectory gardens, and I thought I saw him frown, though he quickly smoothed it out. Did he speak to anyone in particular while standing there? Purbright asked carefully. Not to my knowledge, she replied, lowering her voice slightly, though Mr. Carroway claims he saw him talking quietly to someone unseen, but I find that hard to believe. The lane was empty, and Carroway has a tendency to embellish for effect. Purbright made a mental note of both versions. Truth in Flaxborough, he knew, rarely existed in a single narrative. It was a composite woven from perception, assumption, and occasional truth. Next, he visited Mr. Carroway, who greeted him with a flourish that suggested both pride in being the first to report and an eagerness to enhance his role in the day's drama. Carroway's account was vivid, if exaggerated. "Ah, Inspector, you were not there, but it was remarkable. The vicar, looking pale as any linen sheet, and yet speaking in tones that were almost inaudible. He seemed to whisper to the air itself, I dare say, and then the collapse, oh yes, quite sudden. And, as I mentioned, there was a figure in the lane, barely discernible, yet—" Purbright allowed the man to continue, politely withholding any skepticism. "A figure?" he prompted softly, allowing the suggestion to be elaborated. "Yes, yes," Carroway insisted. "A shadow, perhaps, or a passing servant. One cannot say with certainty, but he seemed to startle the vicar, who then, well, you know the result." Purbright noted the vagueness, the uncertainty, the slight thrill in Carroway's tone at being the one to witness this ambiguous figure. It was precisely the sort of detail that might prove critical once corroborated or disproven by observation of the town's patterns. By mid-morning, Purbright had methodically canvassed several other witnesses: the children who had delivered flowers, the caretaker who maintained the marquee, and even the minor council official responsible for scoring. Each offered snippets of information, often contradictory, yet all circled in some manner around the vicar's notebook, the garden lane, or the unusual stillness he had exhibited before collapsing. It became increasingly apparent to Purbright that the town was not merely concerned with the vicar's health, but with the implications of what had preceded his fainting. In Flaxborough, Any departure from the usual routine was fertile ground for speculation, and the more trivial the detail, the more fertile it became. By noon, he returned to the rectory, notebook in mind, and took a quiet seat in the study. The vicar remained resting, undisturbed by visitors, yet the air carried an unmistakable sense of expectancy, as if the house itself awaited revelation. Purbright reflected on the morning's interviews, noting the subtle inconsistencies, the slight exaggerations, the tentative admissions. It was in these small fractures of human observation that the truth often lodged, he reminded himself. Vicar's collapse might, at first glance, appear unremarkable or even innocuous, yet it had revealed, if only subtly, the complex lattice of interpersonal dynamics, whispered resentments, and concealed expectations that defined Flaxborough. Purbright sipped his tea slowly, letting the town's rhythms settle around him. By the end of the day, he had compiled a list of impressions: Mrs. Pigeon's anxious attentiveness, Carraway's embellished observation, the subtle frowning of the vicar, the unexplained figure in the lane, and the still unopened notebook. Each element, trivial or grand, seemed connected in a way that would only become clear with patient attention and quiet inference. He made no immediate judgments, content instead to let the morning's events settle in his mind. In Flaxborough, the smallest detail, overlooked by the majority, often held the key to understanding the largest mysteries. And in that quiet certainty, he found a calmness that belied the storm of speculation already growing through the town. Dusk approached, he allowed himself a small observation. The day's interviews had raised more questions than answers, yet they had drawn the outlines of a pattern. The vicar's collapse was no simple feint. It was the first ripple in a pond that would, he sensed, extend far beyond the flower show, touching lives and reputations in ways both subtle and profound. By the following morning, Flaxborough had settled into its habitual rhythm, but beneath the ordinary hum of the market and the measured tapping of the town hall clock, there was a subtle, persistent tension. Conversations were no longer entirely neutral. The vicar's collapse had become an unspoken reference point for every interaction, a delicate pivot around which gossip now circled with ever-growing insistence. In the bakery, Mrs. Hargreaves whispered to her assistant about the possibility of scandal in the rectory, while Mr. Carraway lingered by the fountain, offering speculative commentary to anyone who passed, as if determined to cement his role as the town's informal chronicler of misfortune. Even the children, typically unconcerned with adult affairs, had absorbed a trace of the disturbance, and their games now carried a subdued, almost ritualistic caution, as though mirroring the key vicar's fainting spell. Inspector Purbright, taking his habitual early round through the town streets, observed these subtle shifts with quiet attention. He noted the hesitant glances between neighbours, the almost imperceptible lowering of voices when the rectory or the flower show came into discussion, and the peculiar way people seemed drawn, simultaneously, toward and away from any mention of the notebook. These small, ordinary movements spoke to him of patterns larger than any single observation, a lattice of expectation and apprehension that was gradually shaping the town's collective consciousness. Purbright's first visit was to Miss Fenton, who had remained curiously aloof during the flower show and whose presence, or absence, had gone largely unnoticed by all but the most attentive observers. She was at home arranging what appeared to be letters in strict chronological order across her writing desk. When he entered, she looked up with a precise politeness that hinted at both preparation and calculation. "Inspector," she said, rising to greet him, "I trust the morning finds you well." Her tone was courteous yet firm, as though testing whether he might be prone to distraction, which he was not. "Quite well, thank you." Purbright replied, inclining his head. "I wondered if you might recount your observations from the flower show. You were somewhat distant from the main crowd, I believe." Miss Fenton allowed a faint, measured smile. "Indeed. I prefer to observe rather than participate. One sees more from the periphery, and the patterns of behavior are often more revealing than the events themselves." She gestured to a chair. "Please sit. I imagine you have questions, though I must caution you that I am not accustomed to idle gossip." Purbright sat, noting the deliberate way she arranged her hands, atop the desk before speaking. "Not gossip, Miss Fenton. Observation. A subtle distinction, though in Flaxborough, as you know, it is easily lost." She inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging a point that might have otherwise gone unspoken. "Very well. I noticed the vicar's attention wandering unusually. He lingered near the dahlias for a longer period than was customary, yes, but it was not merely the flowers that held his gaze. He seemed preoccupied with something in the distance, or perhaps with an anticipation of some imminent interaction." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Interaction? With whom, do you think?" She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "That, Inspector, I cannot say. He did not speak to anyone in particular at that moment, but one senses these things. Timing, posture, gaze, they are more eloquent than speech when a person is uncomfortable." Purbright filed the remark carefully, noting both the content and the subtle precision with which it had been delivered. Miss Fenton's observations, he thought, would require corroboration before being assigned significance, but they offered a glimpse of a mindset attuned to human nuance, one that might itself contain motives worth understanding. His next visit was to Mr. Redmayne, the chairman of the Flower Show Committee, who received him in his sitting room with a sort of formal briskness. Redmayne had already begun assembling the report for the event, though his movements betrayed a faint distraction. "Inspector," he said, leading him to a chair, "I trust you have been apprised of the incident with the vicar. Quite unfortunate, and one hopes it does not mar the committee's efforts." His tone carried the faintest edge of defensiveness, as though anticipating that Purbright's questions might carry subtle implication. "Indeed," Purbright replied, letting his words settle in the air. "I am interested in your observations of the day, particularly regarding the vicar's behaviour. Did anything seem unusual to you?" Redmayne paused, tapping the edge of the report folder, as if the rhythm might help him order his thoughts. "Unusual? I suppose one could say he seemed distracted. Preoccupied, yes, though not in a way that alarmed anyone at first. He spent some time examining the dahlias, yes, but there was a rigidity in his posture, a slight tension. One might dismiss it as mere concern for the displays, but—" He let the sentence trail, allowing Purbright to draw his own conclusion. "And the notebook?" Purbright asked. "It seems to have occupied a significant portion of your attention." "Yes." Redmayne's fingers twitched slightly. Yes, though I must admit I did not examine it closely. It appeared he held it with affection, perhaps, or necessity. In either case, he was clearly attached to it, and its sudden presence in the flower tent may have contributed, perhaps indirectly, to the fainting incident. Purbright made a small, inward note: attachment, necessity, affection. Words that suggested a personal connection beyond the ordinary. These, he knew, often provided a more fertile field for inquiry than the dramatic or the overt. By late morning, Purbright had gathered sufficient preliminary accounts to begin constructing a loose map of events, the vicar's anticipatory behaviour, the minor exaggerations or omissions in witness statements, the subtle interpersonal dynamics of the Flower Show Committee, and the persistent, though unspoken, significance of the notebook. Each thread, seemingly trivial in isolation, began to coalesce into a pattern suggestive of motives and tensions beneath the town's orderly surface. It was then, as he walked the narrow lane toward the marketplace, that he noticed Mrs. Beauchamp, the local grocer, speaking in low tones to a cluster of neighbours. Her hands, clasped tightly, betrayed a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Purbright lingered quietly, allowing the conversation to filter through his awareness without revealing his presence. "I dare say," Mrs. Beauchamp was saying, "there's more to this fainting than anyone suspects. That vicar, always so precise, so deliberate, to see him like that, well, it unsettles a person, does it not? One might almost think someone or something had disturbed him at the very moment he was expecting repose." Purbright noted the phrasing carefully. Disturbed at a moment of expectation. He filed it alongside Miss Fenton's earlier observations and Redmayne's hesitant remarks. A pattern was emerging, one defined not by overt action, but by subtle social cues, anticipatory tension, and human frailty. By afternoon, Purbright had visited nearly every witness whose accounts might yield useful insight, yet the town itself continued to speculate. Carraway's repeated tales of an indistinct figure in the lane, Mrs. Pidgeon's insistence on minute, attention to floral arrangements, and the quiet, polite hesitations of others coalesced into a shifting tableau of suspicion and intrigue. Each citizen contributed unconsciously, adding colour, exaggeration, and omission, and Purbright, as ever, observed without disruption, knowing that premature conclusions might easily obscure the truth. He returned to the rectory late in the afternoon, notebook in mind, to find Dr. Larkins preparing a modest tea. "He has remained quiet," the doctor said, though restless. "Occasionally he murmurs, but no coherent words. I confess, Inspector, that I am perplexed. A faint, yes, but the manner, the timing, it is altogether peculiar." "Indeed," Purbright replied, settling into the familiar chair. "It is often the peculiar, Dr. Larkins, that illuminates the patterns of ordinary human behaviour. Not the event itself, but its context, its precursors, and the reactions it elicits." He allowed a moment of silence before continuing. "And the notebook, may I examine it?" Larkins nodded, moving it carefully to the table. Purbright lifted the cover, noting the neat, precise handwriting within, the carefully structured notes, and occasional marginal observations. Yet there was nothing immediately alarming. Instead, he allowed his attention to drift to the manner in which the pages had been handled. Certain corners dog-eared, small smudges from hurried annotations, slight indentations suggesting a hand, pressed firmly at moments of reflection or tension. To the casual eye, trivial. To Purbright, an invisible map of mental preoccupation, a trail of subtle human behaviour waiting to be decoded. As the light faded outside, casting elongated shadows, across the rectory study, Purbright leaned back, reflecting on the day's meticulous inquiries. He had yet to identify any immediate suspect, yet the outlines of human interaction were becoming clearer. Anticipation, concern, minor embellishments, and concealed tensions, all converging subtly on the vicar and the notebook he had held so tightly. By evening the town had settled into its quieter rhythms once more, but the undercurrent of speculation persisted. Flaxborough's citizens, each in their own way, were digesting what had occurred, shaping the narrative in their minds, and perhaps unconsciously rehearsing the roles they might play in events yet to unfold. Purbright, seated by the window with notebook in hand, allowed the quiet to settle around him, knowing that the first obvious suspect had not yet revealed himself, and that the day's patient observations were laying the groundwork for a far more intricate understanding of the town's peculiar dynamics. The morning following the thorough interviews and observations found Flaxborough bathed in a delicate light, the sort that suggested ordinary beginnings but concealed subtle stirrings. Beneath The vicar remained at the rectory, quiet and still, and the townsfolk had reverted to their routine appearances of normality, each careful not to let curiosity or suspicion spill into public discourse too flagrantly. Yet beneath the polite exterior, tension simmered. In Flaxborough, the absence of the expected, the vicar's customary presence at morning prayers, his punctual inspections of the churchyard, the habitual rounds of small courtesy, was enough to provoke private conjecture, and in the quiet corridors of the town, conjecture had the peculiar habit of solidifying into narrative. Purbright began his day with a deliberate stroll through the market square, observing the understated choreography of commerce. Mrs. Hargreaves arranged loaves with almost ritual precision, her eyes flicking toward the clock tower as if measuring the passing of time against some invisible standard of propriety. Mr. Carroway lingered near the fountain, rehearsing yet another version of the vicar's collapse for any listener willing to engage. The children, who normally darted between stalls with careless glee, now exhibited a faint hesitation in their steps, as though they, too, recognized that some quiet disruption had lodged itself in the town's fabric. Purbright's attention, however, was drawn to a small, overlooked lane that led behind the marketplace, a narrow passage rarely trodden by those not attending to specific errands. There, near a modest iron gate, he observed a subtle irregularity, a single petal, darkened at the edges, lying on the cobblestones as though it had been dislodged from a bouquet some hours before. He bent slightly, noting the unusual placement. It was trivial in itself, yet something about its solitary persistence struck him as incongruous with the otherwise meticulous tidiness of the town. He continued along the lane, following the faint trail of disturbance, observing the way passers-by, unconsciously avoided stepping on the petal. It seemed a trivial act, and yet Purbright had learned to recognize that in Flaxborough triviality was often the signal of unnoticed tension. Just beyond the gate, the lane opened slightly into a small courtyard behind the church. Here he noticed another subtle detail, the faint imprint of a heel upon the stonework, barely perceptible, as though someone had lingered momentarily in contemplation or anxiety. It was a detail so minor that anyone else would have ignored it, yet to Purbright it suggested both presence and absence simultaneously, a paradoxical signature of human preoccupation. He filed it alongside his observations from the previous days, the vicar's anticipatory behavior, the careful handling of the notebook, the slight exaggerations and omissions of those who had witnessed his fainting. The ordinary surface of the town, he reflected, often concealed its most telling irregularities. Later in the morning, he called upon Mrs. Pigeon, ostensibly to inquire about her roses, but with an eye toward minor inconsistencies in yesterday's accounts. She received him with a mixture of pride and anxiety, fussing briefly with her apron, before directing him to a chair near the window. "Inspector," she said, her voice tinged with polite concern, "I have been thinking about yesterday, about the vicar and the way he seemed to linger near the dahlias. Something in his manner was unusual. Not alarming, but peculiar. One might almost say he was expecting someone." "Someone?" Purbright prompted softly, allowing the word to stretch in the air. "Yes," she replied, leaning slightly forward. "I cannot say who or even if anyone was truly present. But he seemed aware of something beyond my sight, and I noticed it more than once. It was the same subtle frown, the way he adjusted his notebook, the shift of his gaze. I cannot explain it, Inspector, but I thought it important to mention." Purbright nodded, acknowledging the observation without comment. Mrs. Pigeon's attention to such minute variations in behaviour, he knew, could prove more significant than the loudest declarations of the more garrulous townsfolk. He spent the remainder of the morning moving quietly among other residents, each encounter reinforcing the sense of subtle disturbance. Miss Fenton, when questioned again, emphasised the careful precision of the vicar's movements and the slight hesitations he displayed when certain individuals approached. Mr. Redmayne, meanwhile, revealed in passing that a small parcel, which the vicar had been expecting, had been delayed, though he could not recall the details, only that it had seemed to occupy the vicar's thoughts considerably. By midday, Purbright had begun to assemble a picture, not of overt wrongdoing, but of cumulative irregularities. A notebook, handled with unusual intensity, anticipatory movements, toward persons unknown, delayed parcels, minor discrepancies in witness accounts, and subtle traces, petals, footprints, and gestures, that together suggested an underlying tension reaching beyond the immediate fainting episode. The town itself, he reflected, was unknowingly supplying him with the evidence of its own intricacies. It was at this point, while pausing near the edge of the marketplace, that Purbright noticed Mr. Carroway speaking with Mrs. Beauchamp. The conversation was ostensibly trivial, a discussion of bread deliveries and the state of the town's gutters, but Carroway's hand flicked repeatedly toward the lane behind the market, and Mrs. Beauchamp's eyes followed in a manner that suggested awareness of some unspoken element. Purbright lingered at a distance, observing without interference, noting the way gestures and glances betrayed the consciousness of detail that remained invisible to casual observers. By afternoon, he returned to the rectory, the notebook in mind, to continue his quiet scrutiny. The vicar remained resting, and Dr. Larkins reported no new developments beyond minor murmurs and restless shifts during sleep. Purbright allowed himself to examine the room itself, noting small irregularities. A chair slightly shifted from its usual position, a thin layer of dust disturbed along the window-sill, the angle of a lamp subtly altered. Each suggested movement, a trace of anticipation or concern, and when considered together with yesterday's observations, they formed a lattice of behaviour, minor, almost imperceptible, yet significant in totality. As the light softened in the late afternoon, Purbright allowed himself a final round of reflection. The vicar's fainting at first glance seemed a solitary, isolated event. Yet the minor disturbances surrounding it, the careful handling of the notebook, anticipatory gestures, subtle misalignments of objects, the petal in the lane, and the faint heel mark, hinted at a sequence of human reactions, motives, and perhaps even concealments that had yet to be fully understood. Flaxborough, he realized, would not yield its story through spectacle, but through patience, attention, and an appreciation of the smallest irregularities. By evening, the townsfolk had begun to return to ordinary routines, though their conversations carried traces of yesterday's curiosity. Children played with slightly reduced vigour, shopkeepers moved with faintly more attention to the timing of their steps, and in the corners of the streets whispered conjectures continued, always circling but never quite reaching the heart of the matter. Purbright sat by the rectory window, notebook in hand, reflecting on the morning's observations. Each trivial irregularity, he knew, was a thread, and the web it would ultimately form promised to reveal more than any overt statement could provide. By mid-morning, Flaxborough had settled into a rhythm that was superficially familiar, but carried a barely perceptible tension beneath its polite surface. The flower show was a day past, yet its echoes lingered in the meticulous adjustments of shop displays, in the careful arrangement of pastries on bakery shelves, and even in the gentle pacing of the town clock, as though the gears themselves were conscious of recent disturbance. Inspector Purbright moved deliberately through the streets, observing without comment, noting the minor shifts in behavior that marked the undercurrent of unease. His first stop was the small tea room on the corner of Market Street, a place often used for informal gatherings and discreet gossip. Miss Halloway, the proprietor, greeted him with the usual mixture of warmth and mild apprehension. "Inspector," she said, adjusting the teapot on the counter. "I hear you've been quite busy with the vicar's little mishap. Everyone's talking, of course, but no one seems to know quite what to say." "Indeed," Purbright replied, inclining his head. "And what have they been saying here?" "Oh, the usual conjecture," she said, leaning slightly forward. "Some say it was the heat, others suggest the poor man's nerves. But I think there's more to it than that. You see, he was seen walking alone late yesterday evening, near the lane behind the churchyard. That's when he usually prepares his notes for sermons, but there's a way he held himself, careful, as if expecting someone or something." Purbright made a mental note, appreciating the subtlety of the observation. The lane had come up repeatedly, first as a location of minor disturbance, then in whispered hints of presence and anticipation. Here was a consistent thread of behavior, yet elusive enough to require patient untangling. From the tea room, he moved toward the town hall, where council members were beginning their morning routines. The corridors smelled faintly of polished wood and ink, a scent Purbright found oddly reassuring amidst the uncertainty. He encountered Mr. Langford, a minor council official, who greeted him with visible eagerness, clearly pleased to have someone interested in the subtleties of town affairs. "Inspector," Langford began, lowering his voice, "there's been some chatter concerning the vicar's habits, not the collapse itself, mind, but what preceded it. Some council members noted that he received a parcel yesterday morning, earlier than expected, and yet it appears to have been slightly delayed in reaching him." "Curious, yes?" He seemed to check for it repeatedly, almost nervously, and one wonders what it contained. Purbright allowed a faint smile, inward rather than outward. Such small irritations or delays were rarely mundane in Flaxborough, often rippling outward to reveal concerns and anxieties invisible to casual observers. "And who might have delivered this parcel?" he asked softly. Langford hesitated, the pause speaking volumes. "A carrier, normally reliable, but yesterday, well, the timing was off, and the vicar, being what he is, noticed immediately." There was a small frown, nothing dramatic, but enough to mark him as unsettled. Purbright's mind catalogued the detail: anticipation, expectation, slight anxiety. These were human traits, subtle and easily overlooked, yet in combination they suggested a disturbance more intricate than a simple fainting episode. By late morning, he visited several other townsfolk whose routines intersected with the vicar's. The caretaker who maintained the churchyard, noting that he had seen the vicar pause repeatedly at the gate as though scanning for someone. The librarian, who mentioned the vicar, had requested a series of volumes on local history, arriving in unusual haste. And the baker, who remarked on a brief exchange with the vicar at dawn, his tone carefully measured, almost secretive. Each account was fragmentary, occasionally contradictory, but collectively they formed a lattice of human concern, anticipation, and restraint. As he moved through the streets, Purbright observed the social interplay around these facts. Caraway continued his role as town chronicler, repeating tales of shadows, delays, and gestures, his embellishments gaining momentum with each retelling. Mrs. Beecham, whose shop stood across from the small lane behind the church, watched arrivals and departures with a faint, persistent attention, noting the sequence of footsteps, gestures, and brief encounters. And Miss Fenton, seen through the lattice of her front window, arranged papers with meticulous order, her fingers pausing now and then as if pondering unseen irregularities. Purbright paused near the lane behind the church, noticing the fainty traces of yesterday's minor disturbances, the solitary petal slightly shifted, and the heel mark upon the cobblestones. Their triviality belied significance, and he noted them carefully, cataloguing the rhythm of motion, hesitation, and presence. They implied, somewhere amid these quiet traces lay the source of disturbance, waiting to be teased into clarity. By mid-afternoon, he returned to the rectory, notebook in hand, to consult Dr. Larkins and review the vicar's environment. The vicar remained, resting, his expression calm yet inwardly engaged, as if the mind continued its unseen work. Purbright examined the arrangement of objects, the slightly askew chair, the orderly yet subtly altered desk, the small pile of letters recently delivered. Each suggested human concern and preoccupation, minor yet cumulative, building a pattern that spoke of anticipation, delay, and subtle social negotiation. As the day wore on, Purbright reflected on the interactions he had observed. Flaxborough's citizens were themselves agents in a quiet drama, shaping the town's narrative through gestures, whispers, and attentions to detail. The fainting, while ostensibly an isolated event, had revealed underlying currents: expectation, anxiety, miscommunication, and concealed attention. The cumulative weight of these small observations, he noted, was beginning to outline a web of potential motives, subtle interactions, and perhaps the first glimpses of someone whose actions or inactions might have precipitated the vicar's distress. By evening, the town had settled into a gentle lull. Shopkeepers arranged final displays, children played quietly along familiar routes, and the market square lay largely empty, save for a few lingering townsfolk, their conversations punctuated by the polite restraint customary in Flaxborough. Purbright sat quietly near the rectory window, reviewing the day's careful observations, his thoughts turning over the minutiae he had catalogued: the anticipatory gestures, the delayed parcel, the minor misalignments of furniture, the solitary petal, the subtle traces of human movement. These were not dramatic clues nor overtly incriminating. They were instead the gentle perturbations of routine and expectation, quiet disruptions in the otherwise orderly life of the town. Yet Purbright sensed, with that calm certainty born of long experience, that within these tiny disturbances lay the outline of the first clear suspect, not yet fully revealed, but emerging through the careful interplay of observation, deduction, and the persistent patterns of human behavior. By nightfall, Flaxborough had returned to a semblance of quiet normality, though the underlying currents continued to ripple beneath its surface. Purbright, seated with the notebook before him, allowed a small inward acknowledgement. The investigation was now entering a stage where the cumulative weight of minor details, subtle inconsistencies, and human tendencies would begin to coalesce, pointing toward a first tangible focus of attention. The stage was set, the players were observed, and the quiet tension of the town, invisible to all but the most attentive, was preparing to yield its first revelation. The morning arrived with the pale light of early autumn filtering through Flaxborough's streets, and with it came a subtle sense of anticipation that seemed to hum beneath the ordinary hum of the town. The vicar had spent the night quietly resting, though the rectory staff noted minor mutterings and occasional shifts in posture, suggesting a mind still active, even if the body demanded stillness. Purbright, seated in his customary corner of the rectory study, examined his careful notes from the preceding days, tracing lines between incidents, gestures, and minor disturbances, all the while aware that the quiet tapestry of Flaxborough's routines concealed more than it revealed. By mid-morning, the first ripple of a new event reached him. A letter delivered with an uncharacteristic urgency by the postman, marked for the vicar's attention. The envelope bore no unusual markings, yet something in its arrival, a precise, almost deliberate timing, caught Purbright's attention. He examined the notation with quiet scrutiny, noting the style of script, the alignment of the address, and the faint indentation of writing on the back. It suggested an author conscious of being observed, or at least aware of the implications of their correspondence. The letter itself, when finally perused, contained nothing overtly alarming. A polite request for consultation on a minor charitable matter, phrased with the careful civility characteristic of Flaxborough's social elite. Yet, the very act of delivery, the timeliness and the vicar's attentive glance when first receiving it, hinted at an underlying anxiety, a subtle disturbance that extended beyond the letter's content. Purbright noted it with the meticulous patience he had cultivated over years of quiet observation. This was not a moment for hasty conclusion, but for careful integration into the broader pattern of human behavior and interaction he had been tracking. Later, as he made his rounds through the marketplace and adjoining streets, he observed another incident that lent weight to the subtle irregularities he had been cataloguing. A minor disagreement had erupted near the small lane behind the church between Mrs. Beauchamp and a delivery boy regarding a mislaid package. On the surface, it was trivial. A missed delivery, a raised voice, a brief exchange of pointed glances. Yet Purbright noted the timing, the location, and the specific gestures involved. The package in question had contained flowers, identical in variety to those displayed at the flower show and meant for the vicar. The delivery boy, flustered, insisted the parcel had been placed safely, while Mrs. Beauchamp argued with an insistence that suggested knowledge beyond the simple logistics of her shop. Purbright lingered nearby, ostensibly to observe the morning traffic, but in reality mapping the social interactions, noting the subtleties of posture, hesitation and phrasing. The delivery boy, though outwardly apologetic, displayed repeated glances toward the rectory, almost as if expecting to see the vicar's reaction to the delayed flowers. Mrs. Beauchamp, meanwhile, carried herself with a mild tension, her hands, fidgeting with her apron, betraying a faint, conscious awareness of observation. Each element, trivial in isolation, contributed to a growing understanding of anticipation, expectation, and minor concealment within the town. By midday, Purbright turned his attention to the broader circle of residents whose routines intersected with the vicar's day. He visited Mr. Redmayne, who had begun preparations for a follow-up committee meeting, ostensibly unrelated to the flower show, but inevitably drawing connections in the minds of many townsfolk. Redmayne, when prompted for information, offered a carefully rehearsed account of the vicar's preoccupation with details, the precise alignment of forms, the sequence of parcels, and the unexpected arrival of visitors. Purbright listened attentively, noting the slight inconsistencies in Redmayne's phrasing, the small shifts in emphasis, the almost imperceptible adjustments of posture, and the brief pauses that suggested either recollection or fabrication. By the mid-afternoon, a second incident had quietly unfolded. A stack of ledgers, maintained for the charitable accounts of the parish, had been found slightly disordered. The caretaker, responsible for their arrangement, expressed mild concern, noting that the disruption could have been caused by any number of minor accidents, yet he could not recall any particular event that might have caused it. Purbright, examining the ledgers, observed that the displacement was localized. Only a few pages had been shifted, and the marks suggested deliberate handling rather than careless movement. It was an almost imperceptible irregularity, yet in combination with the delayed parcel, the faint heel mark, and the solitary petal in the lane, it formed a constellation of minor disturbances that spoke of human intervention and subtle tension. He returned to the rectory late in the afternoon to find Dr. Larkins quietly arranging the vicar's study. The doctor mentioned, in passing, that the vicar had been unusually restless during his brief period of wakefulness, examining his notebook, muttering under his breath, and occasionally glancing toward the window as though expecting an encounter that had yet to occur. Purbright absorbed the details with quiet patience. Nothing was overt, nothing dramatic, but the combination of anticipation, minor disruption, and human hesitation began to suggest a wider network of influence and interaction than any single witness could provide. Purbright decided to revisit the lane behind the church, walking it deliberately at a measured pace. The petal from previous days had shifted slightly, likely due to foot traffic, and the heel mark appeared more distinct in the afternoon light. He traced the pattern carefully, noting the likely direction of approach and the pause that must have occurred at the point where the mark was deepest. These small observations, though barely noticeable, indicated deliberate movement, controlled and precise, suggestive of a person whose attention was focused on a specific objective or concern. By early evening, Purbright returned to the marketplace, noting the interplay of townsfolk as they began to close shops or gather for informal socialization. Carraway lingered, still embellishing his account of shadows and figures, while Mrs. Beecham moved deliberately about her shop, now seemingly aware of every observer and observer's expectation. Miss Fenton, in the window opposite, continued to arrange papers and letters, pausing frequently as though contemplating an invisible irregularity. Each character, Purbright realized, contributed unconsciously to the unfolding narrative, providing insights into anticipation, concealment, and expectation through gestures, timing, and minor misalignments. As night fell, the town quieted, yet the subtle currents of the day lingered in the shadows. Purbright reflected on the morning's letter, the minor scuffle over the delayed package, the disturbance of the ledgers, and the repeated traces in the lane behind the church. These were not dramatic events in themselves, but when integrated, they hinted at the existence of a first tangible thread, a human presence of subtle influence, a pattern of anticipation and intervention, and the delicate manipulation of expectation. Sitting in the rectory, notebook before him, Purbright allowed himself a moment of quiet consideration. Flaxborough's surface might appear serene, even predictable, yet beneath it ran a lattice of human behavior and social dynamics, minute and deliberate, that hinted at deeper concerns. The fainting incident had been the first visible ripple, but the second incident, the minor disruptions of the day, had confirmed that the vicar's circumstances were influenced by human intervention, subtle and polite, yet significant in their cumulative effect. By the end of the evening, Purbright had assembled a clearer, though still incomplete, understanding of the emerging pattern. There was now a discernible focus, a person whose influence, though unobtrusive, was apparent in the anticipation, gestures, and minor manipulations surrounding the vicar. It remained to be seen whether the observations would reveal intention, mischief, or mere coincidence, but the threads were aligned in a manner that suggested direction, focus, and the first steps toward a coherent understanding of the unfolding mystery. The rectory was unusually still that morning, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves outside the window and the occasional ticking of the mantel clock. Purbright sat in his customary chair, notebook open on the small table before him, yet his attention was not fixed on the pages. Instead, he allowed his mind to wander along the subtle currents he had been tracking over the past several days, considering not only the events themselves, but the human impulses, habits, and understated tensions that animated them. In Flaxborough, the overt and the concealed were seldom aligned. Appearances were carefully curated, and civility was the currency by which secrets were both traded and concealed. He began with the vicar. a man of habitual precision, quiet routines, and measured demeanour whose fainting had catalysed the town's speculation. But what, Purbright reflected, did the fainting truly signify? Not merely physiological collapse, for the vicar was known for his robust constitution, but rather a momentary vulnerability, a pause in the armour of social propriety that revealed, however subtly, the undercurrents of anticipation, expectation, and perhaps anxiety. The notebook, handled with obvious care, was not merely a record of sermons or charitable accounts. It was a locus of concern, a tangible anchor for thought, reflection, and perhaps apprehension. The human attachment to objects, Purbright noted, often illuminated motivations more clearly than words ever could. He considered the minor disruptions of the preceding days, the delayed parcels, the displaced ledgers, the solitary petal, the faint heel mark in the lane behind the church. Each had seemed trivial in isolation, yet collectively they suggested the presence of deliberate influence, movements and gestures performed not for display but for effect, aimed at the vicar, subtle yet persistent. In Flaxborough, such minutiae were magnified precisely because they were so carefully hidden, observed only by those sufficiently attentive to notice the imperceptible shifts that marked human intervention. Purbright's thoughts then turned to the townsfolk themselves. Caraway, the eternal chronicler whose embellishments were themselves revealing, he not only narrated events but coloured them with expectation, anticipation, and anxiety. Mrs. Beauchamp, observant and quietly assertive, whose attention to minor detail suggested both prudence and perhaps the beginnings of private curiosity. Miss Fenton, meticulous and deliberate, whose preoccupation with order might conceal subtle insights or deliberate omissions. Each, in their own way, contributed to the lattice of tension, providing both distraction and inadvertent illumination. And then there was the pattern of timing. Purbright reflected on the sequence of incidents, parcels delivered or delayed, the vicar's anticipatory behaviour, the moments when he paused or glanced towards certain locations, the precise way gestures, and minor movements occurred at intervals that seemed neither random nor purely habitual. The repetition and subtle deviation of ordinary routines suggested a mind deliberately nudged, or perhaps aware of nudging. It was in these minute irregularities, he considered, that the human element of influence revealed itself most clearly, in grand gestures, more in expectation, observation, and polite intervention. As he considered motive, Purbright allowed himself a rare, inward smile. Motives in Flaxborough were rarely dramatic. They did not present as violence, greed, or overt malice, but rather as small, quietly cultivated desires to maintain reputation, to assert influence, to correct perceived error, to anticipate and direct outcomes in the gentlest of ways. These motives often appeared trivial to an outsider, yet in combination with human curiosity and minor anxieties, they could shape the trajectory of events subtly, inexorably, and with remarkable precision. By mid-morning, Purbright decided to cross-examine the timing of all minor incidents. He revisited the lane behind the church, now empty and quiet, tracing the sequence of footprints and disturbances in his mind. The heel mark, previously noted, indicated a pause. The petals suggested displacement. The subtle alignment of cobblestones hinted at repeated presence. He combined these with the vicar's observed anticipatory gestures, the arrival and delay of parcels, and the subtle restlessness noted by Dr. Larkins. The pattern was not yet a story, but the outlines of one were emerging, the vicar as central figure, influenced by human interaction, anticipation, and perhaps discreet manipulation. In the early afternoon, Purbright allowed himself to return to the rectory for reflection. He reviewed the accounts of witnesses, weighing them not for content alone, but for manner, timing, and disposition. Mrs. Pigeon's careful attention to the vicar's frown, Redmayne's hesitant emphasis on minor disturbances and the anecdotal exaggerations of Carraway all formed layers of information, each contributing to a richer, if still incomplete, understanding. It was in the interplay of these observations, the unspoken assumptions, the anticipatory gestures, and the quiet concealments that the emerging pattern began to take shape. He considered also the psychological dimension, the vicar's reliance on routine, his attachment to the notebook, and the subtle ways he monitored his environment. Flaxborough, Purbright reflected, was a town in which social propriety constrained overt expression. Frustrations, expectations, and anxieties often manifested not as argument or outburst, but as deliberate gestures, carefully timed interventions, and minute manipulations of circumstance. The fainting, therefore, was not merely a medical curiosity, but a subtle signal, a disruption in an otherwise tightly regulated equilibrium, a momentary exposure of human vulnerability. By late afternoon, the inspector had sketched a mental outline of the social dynamics in play, anticipation and intervention flowing from subtle motives, the vicar responding with measured care, and the townsfolk providing both interference and insight through gestures and observation. Each person contributed to a network of influence, creating a web in which minor details, displaced ledgers, petal, heel marks, delayed parcels, became more than trivialities. They were the punctuation marks in a quiet narrative of human behavior, expectation, and subtle manipulation. As evening fell, Purbright paused to consider the implications. If the fainting had been catalyzed by deliberate, subtle influence, then the town's network of minor interventions and anticipatory gestures would reveal the actor through pattern rather than spectacle. The solution, he mused, would not emerge from confrontation or overt inquiry, but from the integration of these cumulative signals, the patient reading of gestures, and the quiet observation of human nature in its ordinary yet carefully managed form. By the time dusk settled over the rectory, the town appeared calm, yet beneath the familiar sounds of distant church bells and shuttered windows, Purbright's mind traced the lattice of behavior he had observed. The outlines of influence were emerging, and with them the first hints of a suspect, someone whose presence, deliberate or inadvertent, had shaped events with subtle precision. The path forward, he knew, required not action, but patience and a continued attunement to the minor irregularities that carried the truth quietly, insistently, and invisibly in the rhythms of Flaxborough life. The morning in Flaxborough began as it often did. A gentle stillness permeated the streets, punctuated only by the occasional clatter of shutters or the rhythmic sweep of a broom across the market square. Yet beneath this veneer of ordinary, calm, a quiet tension persisted. Inspector Purbright, as usual, was attentive not to spectacle but to nuance, the subtle gestures, hesitant glances, and minor deviations from routine that he knew carried far more weight than the loud assertions of the garrulous. He began his rounds with the express purpose of observing the vicar's circle under a slightly altered circumstance. Rather than seeking direct testimony, he orchestrated subtle, controlled interactions, measuring reactions and noting even the most imperceptible signs of unease. It was the manner of a conductor guiding a delicate symphony. No notes were played too loudly, yet each movement of the bow revealed the slightest tremor in the strings. His first deliberate observation occurred at the rectory garden, where the vicar, now rested, moved with quiet deliberation among his flower beds. Purbright entered under the pretense of examining the roses, but allowed his presence to be observed rather than acknowledged directly. From the corner of the garden, he noted the vicar's movements, a brief pause, the tightening of hands on the spade, a glance toward the lane beyond the iron gate. It was a repetition of behavior noted on prior days, yet subtly different in timing and intensity. Anticipation had become anxiety, and anxiety now carried a trace of expectation. Purbright's attention then shifted to the visitors arriving at the rectory. First, Mr. Redmayne, ostensibly to discuss routine committee matters, approached with measured politeness. His posture was deliberately erect, his expression courteous, yet Purbright observed the slight tremor of the hands as he extended his notebook for inspection, the fractional hesitation before each word. A pattern emerged, small, involuntary, indications that something beyond ordinary discussion occupied his mind. Later in the morning, Miss Fenton arrived, bringing with her a meticulously prepared folder of observations. She handed it to the vicar with practiced grace, then retreated slightly, allowing Purbright the opportunity to observe the interaction. The vicar accepted the folder with a nod, but the brief lift of his brow and the almost imperceptible tightening of his grip on the notebook betrayed an expectation, a subtle recognition that the folder's contents might contain information he anticipated but could not yet fully access. Purbright noted these subtleties without comment, focusing instead on the reactions of others to the vicar's presence. Mrs. Beauchamp, stationed discreetly near the window, moved with a careful balance of attentiveness and discretion. Her hands were folded over her apron, fingers twitching faintly, eyes darting to and from the rectory gate. Caraway lingered at the edge of the street, narrating his observations to anyone who might lend an ear, yet even he adjusted his phrasing, in response to minor shifts in the vicar's posture, demonstrating the town's unconscious choreography of anticipation. By midday, Purbright had begun a subtle, deliberate exercise. He arranged a series of interactions designed to provoke minute responses, not confrontation, a question, a gentle remark, a staged exchange of glances, all calibrated to observe human instinct at work. The first significant response came from Mr. Redmayne, whose casual inquiry about the timing of the flower delivery elicited a brief flush across his cheeks and a quick adjustment of his jacket. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to Purbright's trained eye, it was telling. Attention had been diverted from routine to awareness, a sign that the subject perceived implication, perhaps even exposure. Later, during a brief pause for tea, Purbright observed the vicar in quiet reflection. The notebook rested on his lap, open to a page meticulously annotated. The vicar's hand traced the lines with an almost imperceptible rhythm, as though reaffirming memory or expectation. Miss Fenton, seated nearby, made a subtle shift in posture, aligning her gaze with a line of vision that passed close to the notebook without direct contact. It was an almost imperceptible tension, a quiet recognition of mutual awareness, yet it carried significance in the context of the preceding day's minor disturbances, the delayed parcel, the displaced ledgers, the heel mark in the lane, the solitary petal. By mid-afternoon, Purbright orchestrated another subtle test. He arranged for a brief, seemingly coincidental meeting in the rectory hallway, the vicar passing with Miss Fenton and Redmayne nearby. Without any overt indication, he allowed a parcel, delivered earlier that morning, to remain partially visible, noting the vicar's glances, the slight stiffening of Redmayne's shoulders, and the fleeting lift of Miss Fenton's brows. Reactions were imperceptible to casual observers, but precise in their timing and coordination. Each micro-expression, each fractional hesitation, was a data point, a subtle signal in the lattice of human expectation and concealed influence. Purbright spent the remainder of the afternoon observing the town from multiple vantage points. In the marketplace, he noted the interplay of gestures and conversation, particularly the ways in which information, or partial information, circulated among residents. Caraway's embellishments continued, now tinged with cautious speculation. Mrs. Beauchamp monitored the flow of foot traffic with renewed attention, occasionally stepping from her shop to follow a delivery boy or returning with a measured glance toward the rectory. The town, unconsciously yet deliberately, provided him with a living demonstration of anticipation, observation, and minor manipulation. By evening, the culmination of these subtle tests had revealed a discernible pattern. One individual, acting with polite but deliberate intent, displayed consistent micro-expressions of concern, anticipation, and momentary hesitation whenever the vicar or his notebook was referenced or within view. The behaviors were minor, never overt, yet cumulatively unmistakable. Attention diverted, gestures adjusted, subtle tension displayed and carefully concealed. Purbright recognized that the polite orchestration of these small actions, whether conscious or not, was indicative of direct involvement in the disturbances surrounding the vicar. As night fell, Flaxborough resumed its quiet rhythms. Shopkeepers, closed shutters, children played in subdued light along familiar streets, and the rectory settled into the stillness of evening. Purbright, seated by the window with his notebook before him, allowed a rare smile of quiet satisfaction. The test had been gentle, polite, almost imperceptible to the participants themselves, yet it had yielded insight, a first tangible focus of suspicion, a discernible thread emerging from the lattice of anticipation, gesture, and subtle manipulation that had quietly defined the preceding days. By the time darkness fully embraced the town, Purbright's mind was active with the integration of these observations. The fainting incident, the delayed parcels, the minor disturbances of ledgers, the minute irregularities in human gesture, all were now converging toward a coherent understanding. The first suspect had revealed themselves, not through overt confession or confrontation, but through the quiet, inescapable logic of human behavior. Flaxborough's calm, ordinary streets had concealed the pattern, but not, Purbright knew, its investigator. The morning was crisp, the kind of autumn air that carried both clarity and the faint suggestion of impending change. Purbright moved through the streets of Flaxborough with measured steps, notebook in hand, observing not just the familiar motions of the town, but the subtler deviations, the hesitation of a shopkeeper's hand, the way a child lingered, just a moment too long near the fountain, the direction of glances and the brief tightening of a brow here or there. Each detail was small, almost imperceptible, yet in the quiet symphony of the town, it was these micro-signals that carried the truth. He arrived at the rectory, entering the garden under the pretense of inspecting the remaining flower beds. The vicar, now largely recovered, moved with his usual composure, though there was a faint tension in his posture, a residual trace from the incidents of the preceding week. Purbright observed quietly, allowing the vicar to arrange the flowers, adjust the notebook, and survey the surroundings. Each gesture was deliberate, habitual, yet imbued with subtle indication of expectation. By mid-morning, Purbright had orchestrated a series of encounters designed to consolidate his observations into clarity. Miss Fenton arrived first, carrying the same folder of notes she had delivered previously. This time, however, she was met with a quiet remark from Purbright, phrased casually, yet with the precision of deliberate testing. Her reaction, a brief tightening of the lips, a fractional shift in posture, a momentary diversion of gaze, was exactly the subtle confirmation he had been seeking. Here was evidence of awareness, not overt, yet undeniable in its manifestation. Next, he invited Mr. Redmayne into the study under the guise of discussing parish records. Their conversation was polite, conventional, yet Purbright allowed pauses, subtle prompts, and the careful placement of documents to provoke natural responses. Each hesitation, glance, or shift in hand position provided insight. The cumulative pattern of minor disturbances, previously noted across days, now crystallized into a coherent behavioral signature. Redmayne, attentive to every cue, betrayed his concern in gestures so slight they might have escaped notice by any observer less patient. The morning in Flaxborough began, as it often did. A gentle stillness permeated the streets, punctuated only by the occasional clatter of shutters or the rhythmic sweep of a broom across the market square. Yet beneath this veneer of ordinary, calm, a quiet tension persisted. Inspector Purbright, as usual, was attentive not to spectacle, but to nuance, the subtle gestures, hesitant glances, and minor deviations from routine that he knew carried far more weight than the loud assertions of the garrulous. He began his rounds with the express purpose of observing the vicar's circle under a slightly altered circumstance. Rather than seeking direct testimony, he orchestrated subtle, controlled interactions, measuring reactions and noting even the most imperceptible signs of unease. It was the manner of a conductor guiding a delicate symphony. No notes were played. Too loudly, yet each movement of the bow revealed the slightest tremor in the strings. His first deliberate observation occurred at the rectory garden, where the vicar, now rested, moved with quiet deliberation among his flower beds. Purbright entered under the pretence of examining the roses, but allowed his presence to be observed rather than acknowledged directly. From the corner of the garden, he noted the vicar's movements, a brief pause, the tightening of hands on the spade, a glance toward the lane beyond the iron gate. It was a repetition of behavior noted on prior days, yet subtly different in timing and intensity. Anticipation had become anxiety, and anxiety now carried a trace of expectation. Purbright's attention then shifted to the visitors arriving at the rectory. First, Mr. Redmayne, ostensibly to discuss routine committee matters, approached with measured politeness. His posture was deliberately erect, his expression courteous, yet Purbright observed the slight tremor of the hands as he extended his notebook for inspection, the fractional hesitation before each word. A pattern emerged, small, involuntary, indications that something beyond ordinary discussion occupied his mind. Later in the morning, Miss Fenton arrived, bringing with her a meticulously prepared folder of observations. She handed it to the vicar with practiced grace, then retreated slightly, allowing Purbright the opportunity to observe the interaction. The vicar accepted the folder with a nod, but the brief lift of his brow and the almost imperceptible tightening of his grip on the notebook betrayed an expectation, a subtle recognition that the folder's contents might contain information he anticipated but could not yet fully access. Purbright noted these subtleties without comment, focusing instead on the reactions of others to the vicar's presence. Mrs. Beauchamp, stationed discreetly near the window, moved with a careful balance of attentiveness and discretion. Her hands were folded over her apron, fingers twitching faintly, eyes darting to and from the rectory gate. Caraway lingered at the edge of the street, narrating his observations to anyone who might lend an ear, yet even he adjusted his phrasing in response to minor shifts in the vicar's posture, demonstrating the town's unconscious choreography of anticipation. By midday, Purbright had begun a subtle, deliberate exercise. He arranged a series of interactions designed to provoke minute responses, not confrontation, a question, a gentle remark, a staged exchange of glances, all calibrated to observe human instinct at work. The first significant response came from Mr. Redmayne, whose casual inquiry about the timing of the flower delivery elicited a brief flush across his cheeks and a quick adjustment of his jacket. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to Purbright's trained eye, it was telling. Attention had been diverted from routine to awareness, a sign that the subject perceived implication, perhaps even exposure. Later, during a brief pause for tea, Purbright observed the vicar in quiet reflection. The The notebook rested on his lap, open to a page meticulously annotated. The vicar's hand traced the lines with an almost imperceptible rhythm, as though reaffirming memory or expectation. Miss Fenton, seated nearby, made a subtle shift in posture, aligning her gaze with a line of vision that passed close to the notebook without direct contact. It was an almost imperceptible tension, a quiet recognition of mutual awareness, yet it carried significance in the context of the preceding day's minor disturbances, the delayed parcel, the displaced ledgers, the heel mark in the lane, the solitary petal. By mid-afternoon, Purbright orchestrated another subtle test. He arranged for a brief, seemingly coincidental meeting in the rectory hallway, the vicar passing with Miss Fenton and Redmayne nearby. Without any overt indication, he allowed a parcel, delivered earlier that morning, to remain partially visible, noting the vicar's glances, the slight stiffening of Redmayne's shoulders, and the fleeting lift of Miss Fenton's brows. The reactions were imperceptible to casual observers, but precise in their timing and coordination. Each micro-expression, each fractional hesitation, was a data point, a subtle signal in the lattice of human expectation and concealed influence. Purbright spent the remainder of the afternoon observing the town from multiple vantage points. In the marketplace, he noted the interplay of gestures and conversation, particularly the ways in which information, or partial information, circulated among residents. Carraway's embellishments continued, now tinged with cautious speculation. Mrs. Beecham monitored the flow of foot traffic with renewed attention, occasionally stepping from her shop to follow a delivery boy or returning with a measured glance toward the rectory. The town, unconsciously yet deliberately, provided him with a living demonstration of anticipation, observation, and minor manipulation. By evening, the culmination of these subtle tests had revealed a discernible pattern. One individual, acting with polite but deliberate intent, displayed consistent micro-expressions of concern, anticipation, and momentary hesitation whenever the vicar or his notebook was referenced or within view. The behaviors were minor, never overt, yet cumulatively unmistakable, attention diverted, gestures adjusted, subtle tension displayed and carefully concealed. Purbright recognized that the polite orchestration of these small actions, whether conscious or not, was indicative of direct involvement in the disturbances surrounding the vicar. As night fell, Flaxborough resumed its quiet rhythms. Shopkeepers, closed shutters, children played in subdued light along familiar streets, and the rectory settled into the stillness of evening. Purbright, seated by the window with his notebook before him, allowed a rare smile of quiet satisfaction. The test had been gentle, polite, almost imperceptible to the participants themselves, yet it had yielded insight, a first tangible focus of suspicion, a discernible thread emerging from the lattice of anticipation, gesture, and subtle manipulation that had quietly defined the preceding days. By the time darkness fully embraced the town, Purbright's mind was active with the integration of these observations. The fainting incident, the delayed parcels, the minor disturbances of ledgers, the minute irregularities in human gesture, all were now converging toward a coherent understanding. The first suspect had revealed themselves, not through overt confession or confrontation, but through the quiet, inescapable logic of human behavior. Flaxborough's calm, ordinary streets had concealed the pattern, but not, Purbright knew, its investigator. The morning was crisp, the kind of autumn air that carried both clarity and the faint suggestion of impending change. Purbright moved through the streets of Flaxborough with measured steps, notebook in hand, observing not just the familiar motions of the town but the subtler deviations, the hesitation of a shopkeeper's hand, the way a child lingered just a moment too long near the fountain, the direction of glances and the brief tightening of a brow here or there. Each detail was small, almost imperceptible. Yet in the quiet symphony of the town, it was these micro-signals that carried the truth. He arrived at the rectory, entering the garden under the pretense of inspecting the remaining flower beds. The vicar, now largely recovered, moved with his usual composure, though there was a faint tension in his posture, a residual trace from the incidents of the preceding week. Purbright observed quietly, allowing the vicar to arrange the flowers, adjust the notebook, and survey the surroundings. Each gesture was deliberate, habitual, yet imbued with subtle indication of expectation. By mid-morning, Purbright had orchestrated a series of encounters designed to consolidate his observations into clarity. Miss Fenton arrived first, carrying the same folder of notes she had delivered previously. This time, however, she was met with a quiet remark from Purbright, phrased casually, yet with the precision of deliberate testing. Her reaction, a brief tightening of the lips, a fractional shift in posture, a momentary diversion of gaze, was exactly the subtle confirmation he had been seeking. Here was evidence of awareness, not overt, yet undeniable in its manifestation. Next, he invited Mr. Redmayne into the study under the guise of discussing parish records. Their conversation was polite, conventional, yet Purbright allowed pauses, subtle prompts, and the careful placement of documents to provoke natural responses. Each hesitation, glance, or shift in hand position provided insight. The cumulative pattern of minor disturbances previously noted across days now crystallized into a coherent behavioral signature. Redmayne, attentive to every cue, betrayed his concern in gestures so slight they might have escaped notice by any observer less patient. Purbright's calm demeanor, his polite inquiry and subtle orchestration created an environment in which truth could emerge organically. He asked questions not to confront but to observe, allowing the suspects to reveal themselves through manner, timing, and unconscious signaling. The parcel that had been delayed, the minor disruption of ledgers, the displaced petal in the lane, and the vicar's anticipatory gestures, all were woven together in a lattice that now pointed to a single nexus of subtle intervention. By early afternoon, the pattern was unmistakable. Purbright had noted how Miss Fenton's gaze followed certain movements, how Redmayne's posture shifted in response to references to the vicar's notebook, and how minor adjustments of the environment elicited fractional responses that cumulatively indicated intention. It was not anger, not overt malice, but deliberate influence, polite yet persistent, designed to shape the vicar's actions in subtle ways. The evidence was behavioral, indirect, and entirely human, yet it formed a clear trajectory toward understanding. Purbright arranged for the vicar, Miss Fenton, and Redmayne to convene in the rectory study. The room was quiet, the sunlight casting a warm glow on the familiar furnishings. Purbright allowed a brief moment for ordinary greetings, then began to speak in his characteristic, measured, understated tone. He recounted events not as accusation, but as observation. The delayed parcels, the minor disturbances of ledgers, the solitary petal, the heel mark in the lane, the anticipatory gestures and subtle restlessness noted across several days. His voice was calm, precise, and polite, yet carried the weight of accumulated insight. As he spoke, he observed the subtle shifts in posture, the fleeting glances, the fractional tightening of hands, confirmation, not speculation. One by one, the behavioral cues aligned, and Purbright's quiet explanations illuminated the pattern. The interventions had not been malicious, rather, they were the product of conscientious human attentiveness, guided by anticipation, minor anxiety, and the desire to influence outcomes delicately. In other words, the disturbances had been deliberate, yet framed entirely within the polite, cautious confines of Flaxborough's social norms. Miss Fenton was the first to respond, her voice soft, yet edged with slight surprise. I thought I was merely assisting, ensuring that the vicar's work proceeded smoothly, she admitted, her eyes momentarily lowering. Redmayne, too, acknowledged his own attentiveness to timing and detail, explaining that he had merely wished to prevent confusion or oversight. Both had acted without malice, motivated instead by conscientious concern, yet the cumulative effect had been sufficient to unsettle the vicar in subtle ways. Purbright allowed them space to reflect, guiding the conversation with gentle prompts, highlighting not blame but understanding. None of these actions, he noted quietly, were intended to alarm or inconvenience, yet in combination, the pattern of intervention created a sequence of minor disturbances that, in totality, contributed to the event you experienced. His voice remained calm, his observation unhurried, leaving room for acknowledgement rather than defensive reaction. By late afternoon, the rectory study was filled with quiet understanding. The vicar, reassured, acknowledged the cumulative effect of minor human attentions, gestures, and anticipations. Miss Fenton and Redmayne, chastened yet relieved, recognized the subtle consequences of their own conscientious behavior. Purbright, seated in his customary chair, allowed a faint inward satisfaction. The web of small disturbances had been traced, the pattern identified, and the human elements understood, not through confrontation or accusation, but through observation, patience, and the integration of subtle behavioral cues. The town outside remained calm, its ordinary rhythms resumed yet informed by the quiet revelations of the day. Flaxborough had once again demonstrated its capacity for minor turbulence under the surface of civility, and Purbright, notebook in hand, quietly catalogued the events for future reflection. The human impulses, the minor anxieties, and the careful attention to detail had been traced with precision, and the underlying disturbance resolved through comprehension rather than recrimination. By evening, the rectory returned to its customary quiet. Purbright, observing the final light fading through the study window, reflected on the town's intricate social dynamics, the subtleties of human interaction, and the manner in which civility, attentiveness, and expectation could both conceal and reveal truth. The investigation had reached its culmination, the threads of minor events traced to their source, and the mystery resolved with the understated civility that was both the hallmark of Flaxborough and of Purbright himself. The first hints of morning. Light filtered through the windows of Flaxborough's rectory, casting a soft glow over the familiar furniture and the well-worn carpet. The town, already stirring with the measured rhythm of daily routines, gave no outward indication that the subtle tension of the previous days had been resolved. Yet, for those attuned to the nuances of the town's social tapestry, the air carried a faint aftershock of understanding, a quiet awareness that events had unfolded, mysteries had been traced, and the human impulses underlying minor disturbances had been gently illuminated. Purbright, seated in his customary chair by the window, reviewed the accumulated observations of the past 10 days. His notebook, open to pages filled with careful notes, diagrams of movement, and subtle behavioral cues, reflected not dramatic evidence, but the delicate latticework of human attentiveness, anticipatory gestures, and conscientious intervention. Each incident, the fainting of the vicar, the delayed parcels, the minor disturbances of ledgers, the solitary petal in the lane, the heel marks in the churchyard, had been examined not as isolated anomalies, but as integral threads in a broader social pattern. The rectory door opened gently, admitting the vicar, now fully recovered in appearance, yet still carrying the quiet shadow of recent tension. His movements were measured, his hands resting lightly upon the back of a chair as he surveyed the room. Purbright greeted him with his customary politeness, allowing the vicar space to speak, to reflect, and to frame the narrative in his own words. The conversation flowed gently, with neither urgency nor alarm, yet every gesture, every pause, provided further clarity on the social dynamics that had subtly influenced his recent distress. Miss Fenton arrived shortly thereafter, bringing with her the last of the carefully prepared notes. She was composed, her posture upright, though her eyes betrayed the faintest trace of residual concern. Purbright observed the micro-expressions, the fractional hesitation before setting down the folder, the momentary diversion of gaze toward the notebook, the subtle adjustment of fingers along the edge of her papers. These minute gestures, previously noted in isolation, now coalesced into a clear signal: awareness, conscientious attention, and inadvertent influence, all framed within the politeness and propriety characteristic of Flaxborough's social fabric. Mr. Redmayne followed, entering with the measured politeness that had accompanied his interactions throughout the week. He offered a gentle nod to the vicar, then settled in a chair, hands lightly clasped. Purbright allowed the natural flow of conversation to proceed, interweaving observations with gentle queries, highlighting patterns of behavior without accusation. The effect was subtle but profound, each participant attentive to the polite rhythm of dialogue began to recognize the cumulative consequences of their minor interventions. Purbright began to articulate the sequence with careful precision. He recounted the initial fainting, the timing of parcels, the minor disruption of ledgers, the positioning of objects, the foot traffic, and minor gestures in the lane behind the church. He spoke not to blame, but to illuminate, to demonstrate how conscientious concern, anticipatory attention, and the minutiae of human behavior had intersected to create an outcome that, while unremarkable in danger, had nonetheless unsettled the vicar. Each subtle disruption, when combined, formed a discernible pattern, a gentle yet undeniable orchestration of influence. As he spoke, Purbright observed the responses of those present. Miss Fenton's fingers trembled faintly as she folded the folder. Redmayne's gaze occasionally flickered toward the rectory window, and the vicar's hands rested lightly on the edge of the desk, his posture relaxed yet attentive. Each gesture confirmed the accuracy of his deductions. The disturbances had been neither malevolent nor random, but the result of conscientious human attentiveness framed in the etiquette and propriety of Flaxborough life. The vicar spoke quietly, acknowledging both the insight and the subtlety of the investigation. "I see now," he said, "that the events were not due to neglect or malice, but rather the careful attentions of those around me, acting in the interest of order and propriety. And yet even good intentions can carry consequences beyond expectation." His words, calm and deliberate, resonated with understanding rather than reproach. Miss Fenton added softly, "I had not considered that my own attentiveness, though meant to assist, could contribute to such unease. It is humbling, yet illuminating." Redmayne nodded in agreement, his expression reflecting mild relief and a touch of self-awareness. They had all participated, unconsciously or otherwise, in a chain of minor influences that in combination produced the observed effect. Purbright's quiet orchestration and observation had revealed the truth, not through confrontation, but through the patient integration of behavioral patterns. By mid-afternoon, Flaxborough itself resumed its routine, though a subtle change had occurred. The townsfolk moved through familiar streets with the same politeness and civility, yet the events of recent days lingered as an invisible imprint on social consciousness, a recognition of the ways in which minor attentions, anticipations, and gestures could accumulate, influence, and even unsettle the ordinarily serene rhythms of daily life. Purbright, notebook closed for the moment, observed the town from a quiet vantage point, noting the ordinary yet enriched interplay of human behavior, awareness, and subtle influence. The rectory settled into evening, its rooms quiet, the soft glow of lamps casting gentle shadows across familiar furniture. The vicar, Miss Fenton, and Redmayne retired to their routines, each carrying with them an understanding of human subtlety and the unforeseen impact of conscientious attention. Purbright lingered only briefly by the window, reflecting on the intricate lattice of minor interventions, anticipatory gestures, and understated human behaviors that had produced the week's events. The town's equilibrium, once disrupted, had been restored, not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet observation, patient deduction, and the gentle illumination of social patterns. As night deepened, the streets of Flaxborough lay quiet once more, the ordinary rhythms restored yet enriched by the understanding of subtle human interplay. Purbright returned to his desk, pen in hand, and began the meticulous cataloguing of events, gestures, and observations, preserving in careful detail the threads of human behavior that had quietly shaped the week's incidents. The mystery was resolved, the pattern traced, and the town, in its usual polite civility, had resumed the gentle cadence of everyday life, forever subtly altered by the insights gained through patient observation.